The years 2020 and 2021 will long be remembered as a time when the whole world was ravaged by a deadly virus. But not for the first time. The Spanish flu, for example, killed millions in the early part of the century, and even further back, the Black Death and bubonic plague wiped out half the population. But out of these tragedies came many acts of courage and selflessness, from the NHS heroes and frontline workers of today back to the Middle Ages, when the inhabitants of a small Derbyshire village showed exceptional courage in the face of a deadly disease. Their actions had far-reaching and important consequences for the development of the treatment of pandemic diseases. This is their story. Nestling in a picturesque and idyllic countryside setting, the village of Eyam has much for the visitor to see. The well-kept houses are of local stone and brick, and local traditions are rigorously upheld. It's hard to imagine, but this tranquil place has a dark past and a tragic story to tell. In 1665, the City of London was being ravaged by deadly bubonic plague. Left to fend for themselves, the poor and uneducated of London faced a merciless and terrifying foe. The unfortunate victims couldn't know that the numerous indigenous rats carried fleas which transmitted the disease to humans. The plague was centred on London, but unwittingly a parcel of flea-infested cloth was sent from there to the tailor in Eyam. The cloth arrived cold and damp, and was hung near the fire to dry. The heat activated the dormant fleas, and they started to spread. The plague had reached the village, and many were to succumb to the disease over the following 14 months. On the west side of the church are the cottages where the plague began. Many of the buildings have plaques giving details of their history, their inhabitants, and their fate. As the plague started to decimate the population, the village rector, William Mompesson, introduced a number of precautions to help reduce the risk of infection, including the quarantine of the entire village to prevent spread of the disease to people in the surrounding countryside. Services were held in the open air at nearby Cucklet Delph, and as illustrated in this painting, families stood apart from each other to avoid the spread of infection. Social distancing isn't a new thing by any means. Food and supplies donated by outside sources were left at either the boundary stones or at what became known as Mompesson's Well. The villagers left money in return, which was either purified by the running water in the well or left in vinegar-filled holes as a sterilisation measure. This is Riley Lane. Elizabeth Hancock had the grisly task of dragging the bodies of her husband and 6 children along this lane and burying them in Riley Field, which was part of their farm. They'd all died within a 6-day period, and their graves are preserved within this enclosure. Elizabeth herself was immune to the plague and one of the few survivors. August 1666 saw the highest number of victims. The weather was hot that summer, which meant that the fleas were more active and the pestilence spread unchecked throughout the village. Victims were not allowed a burial in the churchyard itself, but the local church retains many relics of that sad time. Around 260 deaths out of an estimated population of 800 were attributed to the disease until finally the plague had run its course. Today, Eyam has several points of historical interest, such as the museum, which is a repository of plague-related items. Opposite the church is the old market hall, once used as a meeting room at the time of the plague and now housing a tourist information centre. The buildings still look much as they might have all those years ago. Eyam retains a large part of its heritage, with traditional events still taking place, such as the annual sheep roast. Good for the tourists, not so good for the sheep. This is one of the best preserved villages in Derbyshire, on the threshold of Eyam Moor, which is a fine area for walking and sightseeing. But of course, the visitor can't pass by without being reminded of the tragic events that took place here almost 350 years ago, and admire the courage and the selfless bravery that limited the spread of a deadly disease. And the legacy in the long term is that scientists, doctors and the medical world used Eyam as a case study in the prevention of disease today.